Welcome to Do It for the Gram and Enneagram podcast with your host, certified Enneagram coach Milton Stewart, where we do it for the Enneagram, not Instagram. We make moves to improve our lives and those in our community. I'm super excited today. I have a brother of mine as the interviewee, an absolutely incredible person. So let me introduce him a little bit. So here we have Deon. He is a psychiatric nurse practitioner and he works with the VA system. Growing up in a military family with a big extension for his passion for serving the veterans. Moreover, as a mental health advocate and as a person who practices self-care in several ways, including running, he's ran one marathon and training for the next. Crazy, bro. I don't know how you do that one. Nurturing his body with earthly treats, practicing yoga, and integrating a holistic lifestyle. Further, a pillar of the foundation is being an ambassador for the community, specifically the LGBTQ plus rights. D Gibbs, let me introduce my brother to you all. D Gibbs, how are you doing, bro?
Man, I'm blessed, highly esteemed. I really appreciate you bringing me to this format, man. I'm looking forward to this.
Yes. So, I think this is one of the most interesting stories. So, for listeners, D is relatively new to the Enneagram, but not new to inner work and working on himself. He's been doing that for a long time. So, D, what is like your story, and how did you like get to know the Enneagram? What's been your journey of understanding it? Just kind of let us know how's that look for you.
Sure. So just a quick background for me. I work in the mental health sphere. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. Therefore, I am a provider. I provide medications for veterans, but I also provide psychotherapy. And a big portion of mental health is that inner work. Not necessarily that you would consider the Enneagram, but there's a lot of different characteristics that tie into it, right? So we're always looking for different holistic features to help our veterans out. Um, a quick, easy thing that a lot of people do, especially in the corporate world, is different personality tests, right? There's always a bunch of different personality tests. The Enneagram sphere is something that I kind of always know about just from a Christian standpoint, but I never really jumped into it. I actually didn't get really involved into it until I saw your inner work in the Enneagram. And I was like, wow, my boy Milton's doing it. He's really invested in it. Let me just take a look at it. And then when I took some generalized exams and generalized tests, I always turned out to be a type 8. And quite frankly, it's one of those things that I quickly identified with until I kind of met with you and you kind of gave me a little bit more clarity. But, I grew up in a very authoritative family. I grew up in an authoritative family of two type 8s, father self-pres 8, mother more, probably more of a one-to-one 8. And that really shaped my sphere. It really shaped my ability to be a healthcare professional. But jumping into the Enneagram standpoint, I wanted to learn how to grow within myself. Um, I found out very quickly that part of being a mental health advocate is also understanding how to be vulnerable with yourself. You can't help other people without understanding your own drawbacks, without your own flaws and your own blind spots. So, really fall into
Facts.
that Enneagram spec and that Enneagram spirit helped me get to that point.
Yeah. Okay. So, what's the? Because you call like so. I don't think you share with them that your type structure because we're talking
Hmm.
about countertypes. So
Hmm.
can you tell them your type, your pattern, and tell them the phrasing you use for it?
Sure. So, kind of following up with you in this discussion with you, I always was like, oh, I'm definitely this type A. I'm definitely this type A. I'm definitely this type 8. And then you kind of addressed it and said, yeah, type 8 is one thing, but the more and more I know you, you're more of a type 6, actual, a sexual 6. When I heard about the sexual 6, I didn't know what that meant. I kind of got slightly offended. I was like, what's going on here? Like that doesn't sound accurate. That doesn't sound right. What do you mean by this sexual 6, Um, the more and more I read it, the more and more I looked into it, I found out that, you know what? Really scanning my population, scanning my own comfort zone was a big thing for me. Um, it is a pro in what I do for a living because I'm very analytical and I can also outsource different things in terms of coming up with treatment plans. I'm also very policy driven. So from a leadership standpoint, corporations love that. I can see those big risk and benefits things easily. The
Mhm.
flaw is this: when you get caught up in some of that fear, you start overthinking and then you get stagnant. Um, so that's a big thing. Another thing is coming up with maybe false characteristics of things to be fearful of. I like to call in the mental health world um, kind of that self-toxicity. You kinda sit there and you kinda, like, figure out, "Hey, like, I'm fearful of getting cheated on, so you know how I'm not gonna get cheated on? I'm gonna say every woman cheats." And then you guess what you do
Mm.
from that standpoint? You put that false dilemma on every woman when that's not the case, and it can cause some of that paranoid delusions. So that sexual 6 thing definitely caught me off guard a little bit until I truly and really understood what it meant, that one-to-one social interaction.
Yeah. Ooh. And and I love what so D calls it the sexy six.
Yes, the sexy
I,
six, the sexy
I
to
love
me,
it.
the sexy six is and that's my own kinda twist to it because I think it is sexy to be a six, you know? Sometimes people see sixes as fearful, and sometimes people see sixes as like, "Wow, I don't know if I can, like, be around somebody who's always just scanning and always just so fearful," and kinda just so that self-criticism, but sixes come in a lot of different shapes and form, and that's kinda what you introduced me to from being a sexy social six, self-pressed six. All those things are completely different than social six. The fear is
Yeah.
there, but how we interact with the fear and how we respond is quite different.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. This is perfect. It's perfect. So you mentioned um I think this is one of the I think best points. So when you first would read typical stereotypical enneagram stuff, especially 8, you would see part of you to a degree. So what would you say looks like an 8 that you operating in? Like what looks externally like an 8, and then tell them what's the difference internally that you feel compared to what's happening externally.
Sure. So externally as an eight, naturally, the one thing that I find is I kind of come off, and I don't say this without humbleness, but naturally, it looks like you come off as that authoritative figure. You have all
Mhm.
the answers. You're there to basically stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. That's the biggest piece you see from the eight. And you see more eights are kind of projected to be more authoritative. The inner side of me is people don't get that I am very fearful, but that fearful doesn't drive me to flight. It drives me to fight. And I always
Right.
say it's like a equal dance. It's a dance of like, man, I have fear for this, but I don't have fear enough to run away from the problem. I want to go to the problem and solve the problem. And I think from a sexual six or a sexy six standpoint, I kind of differentiate from the eight, which is a little more authoritative, and they kind of have that blind spot of like fear is weak. Like if you fear for something,
Mhm.
that's a weakness, and I don't want to be around that weakness. Versus the sexual six, we use that fear to drive us. And that fear of driving me has led me to a lot of different places, but it's also caused a lot of different flaws, right? I definitely can admit from a mental health standpoint, self-sabotaging relationships because of the fear that I have. So, I mean, I think with the Enneagram and growing with the Enneagram, it has absolutely allowed me to not only see what are some of the pros of my personality, but also what are the flaws. And I think that's what separates the Enneagram from a lot of other quote unquote personality test.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think this is what's so interesting. And you kind of mentioned it. Sexy sixes. I'm gonna use your phrase because it's just perfect today. Sexy sixes. They do sometimes stereotypically come off as eights because they don't mind challenging, right? And for the sexy six, fear makes them move forward and go into fight instead of flee or hide or freeze necessarily. They have a tendency to go into fight. So like that thing is so specific, but it's important for sexy sixes to know. Why is it important? I want to ask you this. So when you finally figured out you was like, oh shoot, I'm a sexual six instead, I'm a sexy six. Why was that important for you to find out when it comes to your inner work?
Sure. So again, the biggest piece of that is that being a fearful drivenness, right? And that fearfulness, again, fear in itself, and I like to say this to my veterans, because I really am very careful with putting negative connotations to emotions. fear itself is not a bad thing, but it's what you do at that fear. So say if I'm in an unsafe, stressful situation and I have that fear, the way I can act out is either by isolating, or it could be the opposite. I can get to a point where I'm very irritable, I'm very agitated, and then I can definitely cause some of that discomfort with my peers and some of my coworkers. However, if I use that fear in a more positive light, that not only provides me with security, but it also allows me to support my coworkers in things that they might not see. So, for example, when I use the fear of, and I think I gave you a good example last time, kind of talking about, part of my other job is being an infectious disease nurse. And I look at a
Yeah.
lot of policies and procedures. One thing that happens a lot of times, and with especially with COVID vaccination, is CDC is constantly changing different things, right? So part of that fear thing is that, again, fear doesn't necessarily have to mean bad. Part of my fear thing is, let me just make sure I'm up to standards, not only for myself, but for my peers. So by looking at some of this policy and procedures, not only can I identify where can our shortcomings be, but I can educate my fellow peers, which also directly influence the patients that they're giving care to, right? So all that stuff works in itself. But if you look at the negative standpoint or the unhealthy standpoint of fear is, what if I'm like, wow, this CDC thing changed. Now my mind is just going 100 miles per hour. I never come up with a good plan. I am stuck in that moment. And instead of actually helping people, I find myself more complaining and not doing the things I need to do. That's just a simple example of, like, from a practical standpoint, how that fear can take you from being healthy to unhealthy.
Yeah. There was this I love that. It reminds me of so D was one of the people who was able to go to Greece with us this past year. Absolutely incredible trip. And like there were some things that happened and D was so prepared. It was like hyper awareness to jump into preparedness. And then like you knew all the information we needed to know. You was like, all right, so this is what the next steps need to be done. I was like, well, this feels good because I don't have to worry about this. He's like, this is the next step. I was like, yes. Oh my goodness. Um, so it was incredible to see that because that's the part of the six where it's like you are aware of what's happening, right? Being prepared because, like you said, fear doesn't have to have a negative connotation or a great connotation. It is what it is how we use it. And so the ability to use fear to say, okay, how can we be prepared for if this, then that, and we'll know what to do. So we're safe, we're good, everybody's good. And I think you do a great job of that in many areas of your life. I've seen. Um, Something I remember in college. This is where like I remember it was one time I tried to bring the Enneagram to our apartment. Um, I had no clue what I was talking about at the time. Man, my goodness, I was just excited about the Enneagram.
Man, that was a long time ago. You're going back to before we were gray, we're young in our days,
We
man. I
so great
mean, we
now.
had air, we had, we we're putting Bengay on, man. You're going way back when. I mean, I'm wearing
Oh,
CPAP, like things are different, but yeah, that's you're going way back when now.
um, and I remember, didn't know subtypes then or anything like that. And at that time, because of the strength of your energy, I would say I would have thought an eight, right? Because of the strength of your energy. But the more I look back on all the details on like how you operated and the things you did, and I was like, no, that wasn't eight at all. Because one piece that I noticed that wasn't eight is that, and I think this is a difference between the sexy six and the eight in general. I never feel like and you may feel different, but I don't get the feeling that you have to feel like you need to control people and I don't get that. Like I do get that
Mhm,
from eights, but I don't
mhm,
get that from sixes. Not a sense of like controlling the people, right? It may
mhm,
be like looking at the factors of the situation to
mhm.
help that healthy control us, but it's not a controlling of people in a sense. I don't get
Sure.
that from you.
I would agree, and I would say I don't naturally feel like I navigate very well in, like, a leadership role, even though I'm thrust upon that. I think part of being a sector six is you can act as a leader in so many different ways. So me being a sector six, like prime example at my job, I'm considered a primary preceptor. Therefore, I train a lot of the medical students. I train a lot of the, psychiatric nurse practitioner residents because my teaching mode goes into, hey, when you're coming up with a treatment plan, look at all the different risks and then bring it in a holistic, individualized role. I naturally can do that. I can naturally control and lead a group of people in one way and then do it in an authoritative way or even in a persuading way. That's not where I'm
Mhm.
comfortable at. So I wholeheartedly agree with you with that. And I think a lot of sexual six probably feel that way. We're thrust in leadership
Mm.
roles because we do have that analytical mindset. And that analytical mindset is so good at so many different levels. But in terms of kind of like you're saying, having to have control and leading people in that type of mind frame, that's not where we naturally operate at.
Yeah. Uh, and that just reminds me again, going back to our older days, like these details that it like really was like, okay, this makes more sense. So D and I, for those listening, we were in the same social club. At some schools call them frats, whatever, and we were going for leadership positions. And so I went for president, and D went for vice president. And D didn't even want president because I knew
Mm-mm.
I was like, my thing was, I was like, because if D would have ran against me as president, ain't no telling. Like he could take me easy because he had enough sway influence as well. Like it would be a real true challenge. And like D was like, no, I'm good. You can do president, I'll be VP. And it was
Yeah.
great.
No, naturally I felt that way, and it was one of those things that I don't navigate very well, and I don't know how many listeners are into that Christian sphere, but I always say, "You're like Paul, and I'm like Barnabas." I naturally work very well as a Barnabas in the world, and, from the VP standpoint, I'm not necessarily the face, but there's a lot that I'm doing behind the scenes to mitigate and minimize a lot of risk factors, and that's what drives me. And again, I didn't know this. I didn't know doing something like that would directly influence where I was 15 years ago. It took a lot before I found out my pathway and my professional road. I wish I would have knew some of this Enneagram stuff a decade ago because it probably would have saved me for a lot of heartache from relationship, from a professional standpoint. But when it all comes together, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it helps me grow not only as a provider within myself, it also helps me identify ways to interact with my fellow peers and colleagues because sexual six identify and they interact differently with a whole host of different Enneagram types. And I think that's one thing that also the Enneagram taught me is like, okay, I have this colleague who's probably a specific, like example, type one. The way I talk to a type 8 can't be the same way I talk to and interact with a type 1. Those are little nuances that the Enneagram has taught me, but if you don't know that type of stuff, you could be left floundering in the work world. So I think that's very important to understand as well too.
Yeah. I want you to give some insight to what are some best ways, because I think when people don't understand the sexy six, they may feel that they are antagonizing or coming at them in a way
Mhm.
that they may not be able to handle it. You know what I'm saying? So I want you to give some insight into what are some best ways to operate and work with a sexy six.
Sure. So I think one of my favorite phrases, and I'm not going to sit here and say I claim that, I certainly didn't claim it. Again, I heard it from a psychotherapist. It's called the generous assumption. So the generous assumption is saying giving somebody someone's rope and the wit band to understand when somebody does something or act out, before you take offense or before you think that they wronged you, consider that they may be doing this to try to provide some type of support from you. So with the sexual sex or the sexy sex, again, as we mentioned, that fear factor, that analytic mind, really trying to minimize risk. When we're interacting with people, it can be kind of scary at times, especially if you're interacting with like a boss, right? Because we're naturally questioners. We're going to always question things,
Yep.
right? The first time you tell us something, we're not going to just, and if you're a boss, if you're a leader, listening to this, please understand is when you identify your sexual sex person, you might have to come to that person 2 or 3 times if they finally understand, like, hey, okay, I get it. Okay, I trust this. When we're naturally questioning things, don't assume we're questioning your authority. Don't assume that we're questioning your trust. Don't assume that we don't think that you are a genuine person, a genuine partner. We're doing that out of our own fear to hopefully find a way to minimize different type of risks. So that generalized assumption, it's very, very, very important. Another thing to understand is we have a very small trust circle, but when you get in that trust circle, man, we will go to hell and back for you. We are very, very, very loyal. You'll find a lot of sexy sixes. We're pretty direct people, and sometimes it's hard when we don't get that directness back. When we have to question, like, okay, are you being direct with me? Why can't you just be direct with me? That can lead to a little bit of unsafe security, and then we start questioning stuff. So, one thing for a sexy six is please absolutely be very, very direct. My current girlfriend right now, she's a sexual three, and she's very healthy, but she also has like that performance-based stuff. And one thing that we kind of
Mhm.
communicate with is, hey, be direct with me. And that's a very struggle with her 'cause she's the nicest person in the world. But sometimes as a sexy six, I need to hear, Dion, you are annoying me, and this is why. And I take that much better than kind of beating around the bush. So just understanding that directness thing is a really big piece for us. Understanding that trust and loyalty is a very big thing for us. Understanding that if you do something to break that trust, it might take a little bit to get back into it, and please don't take offense to that. That's part of our own inner work that we gotta work on too, because we really struggle with that gray sometimes. A
Mhm.
very healthy sexual sex can live in the gray, but not all the time, and I wanna press upon that,
Right.
not all the time. So when you're interacting in sexual sex, be direct. Understand when you're in that trust circle, loyalty is very important, so honesty is very big. Understand that we're natural questioners, so don't take offense to that. That's something that kind of works through our mind and that just helps support who we are from our own security.
Yeah. And it's needed in the world. I mean,
Mhm.
there are moments where, everybody's going one way because nobody thought about the thing that needs to be thought about. And the six, and especially the sexy six, is like, hey, what about this? What if this happened? Did y'all think about that? Are we prepared for that? And it's actually like, oh, they're right. We need to
Right.
actually
Right,
um
and that could be annoying to a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people are kinda like, "Oh my goodness, why does this person gotta go to the worst, the worst, the worst, the worst, the worst, the worst?" And sometimes we have to catch ourselves with that too. But as you mentioned, Mel, it's absolutely needed. We wanna that's another thing about the sexual sex is you're very just quick and impulsive, and sometimes, my parents, for instance, are eights, different types of eights, but they're eights, and sometimes they think they're so right, they can, like, impulsively jump into something, and then that's when my
right.
sexual six comes out and say, "Whoa, hold on, you're making me uncomfortable here. Let's see the
Mhm.
facts of this," and so some people,
Mhm.
that's like, "Why are we wasting time questioning things?" So it is a wonderful dance to have, under the right circumstances, of course.
Yeah. I think that's so important. I'm so glad you mentioned all those three different layers of how to interact with a sexual six, because I think sometimes people may not know until they really get to know them, and they find that, like, oh, they're asking this from a place of really wanting to make sure you're prepared for whatever is to happen or what is to come. And I think that is the other piece of it that's so powerful, is that the loyalty piece, the trust piece. When you get there, I think, because I know in college and different places we would argue in sports and stuff, and people would think we were about to fight, and like
Absolutely.
they
Absolutely.
would think
Very
we're about to
animated
fight.
arguments, very animated,
Right.
yeah.
And
Absolutely.
then
It's like, no, this is my brother. This is how we communicate,
right.
man. This is what it is. There's
Yes.
all love underneath this.
Yeah, and what I also love about the sexy six and the sexual six, and what you've done for me throughout our process of knowing each other, is that, like, you have called me out when I was out of pocket. You have called me out, and I was like, dang, he right. I was like, okay, all right, he right.
And I'm so very appreciative that even back in the day that you were receptive to that because and it's not I can count my hands how many times that's has happened, right? I mean, I've always seen you as a leader. You've always been at the forefront of different things. You've always been very forward thinking. But at the same token, being part of, a community and you being one of my brothers, it is one of those things that sometimes that's needed, a gentle thought challenge and again, sexual six person, gentle thought challenge from a healthy space. It's much different than a sexual six or sexy six from an unhealthy space, calling somebody out because that can be what we perceive that they're doing
Mhm.
wrong. So that unhealthy fear is that projection of, I feel unhealthy, I feel unsecure, I'm calling you out on something that I'm projecting you on. So it's two different things from that. Sometimes a sexual six and an unhealthy spirit, they don't have all the facts. They have their internal facts they think is right,
Mhm.
and they project that on the other person. So it is certainly, again, a thing that you have to distinguish.
Yeah. Boy, yeah, it'll work, man. I'm hearing this it'll work. I don't think people know. That's the thing. When you get interested in something, especially like one, especially a sexual dominant type, when they get interested in something, and then being the six, the way that they can devour information and start to accumulate it and then figure it out and piece it together mentally. Bro, D, you have like, I'm loving this. Like you just like, man, it's awesome. What's your favorite part of the sexy six?
So my favorite part of the Sexy Six again, and I always I don't know how appropriate this is, but I'm gonna say it. One of my favorite phrases, Steven Jackson says it, and I love it. And I always tell people that people always ask me in my job. My role is a very hybrid role. I wear four different hats, and I love it because I can compute different things very quickly. And I again, being a sexy six is perfect for the mental health psych and P role, in my opinion, because I can see all the risk factors in somebody's treatment plan and come up with a holistic approach. But people always ask me, don't you feel like you have so much pressure on your shoulders? And I always say, my phrase, you might know it, Mill. I say it, I
I
make
know
love
it.
to pressure. I make love to pressure. I run to pressure. Like that's what drives me, man. That fear is what gets me going. It's a high for me. So being a sexual six compared to like a self-purpose six or a social six, again, the fear factor and how we deal with those fears is completely different. The sexual six, under a very healthy space, or even an unhealthy space, are going to run to that fear, and it's how we respond to that. So that is one of my favorite things. When I saw that slight, that's what really made me identify it. Because again, please do not think under this, you know, exterior that I absolutely have it all together. I certainly don't, and nobody does, right? But the drive of failure, the drive of not being the best for my community, the drive of not being the best partner, the drive of not being the best friend, the drive to not be the best provider forces me to grow within myself and do that inner work. And again, it's a balance, right? It's not a situation where if you're driving so hard, you go 100% to one way and then you have those blind spots, right? You got to have a healthy balance. And that's what a sexual six has to see within themselves. A very healthy sexual six. Unhealthy six won't see that, right? They get caught up in one thing, one flaw, one mind frame, and they are stick to that. And then that'll cause them to be very stagnant. And then you lose yourself. That can impact your work life, that can impact your social life, that can impact your romantic life. So it's important to have that insight.
Mm. Killing it, man. I'm over here so excited right now. Man, I'm so excited right now. Um, so what advice, encouragement, or recommendations would you give to another sexy six along the journey? Someone who's coming along and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm a sexy six. What do I do now? What advice or encouragement would you give them?
So the first encouragement that I give them, Beatrice Chestnut, she's a very, well-renowned Enneagram author, is whatever work that she has, read about your type. Read about your type because we all have blind spots. And if you don't know those blind spots, it is absolutely hard for you to have any type of inner growth. So that's number one. The number two is this: when you have that fear and when you have that anxiety, be careful with the negative connotations of saying fear is bad, anxiety is bad, and then trying to become perfect, quote unquote, perfected by saying pushing away the fear or pushing away the anxiety, because the fear is what drives the sexual sex. It's part of us, right? But it's how you handle and respond to that fear is very important. Another thing I would say is give yourself some grace because you're going to make mistakes down the road and down the path, right? Some of that fear, driven fear, is going to lead to conflict in romantic relationships, maybe social relationships, maybe your personal life. When you're in that situation, it's important to not freeze. It's important to not get stuck. I like to call it getting unstuck. Okay. So when you get in unstuck, you're making sure that, You're following within yourself. You're doing some mindfulness. You might reaching out to other friends and family. And I think another big thing for the sexual sex is be able to accept, self-criticism and criticism from others, right? And understand that criticism can come from a healthy space. We naturally are going to be questioners, but sometimes when people question our motives, we get a little defensive and then we want to isolate. And we got to be very, very careful with that type of stuff. But first and foremost, you don't know until you know. Really get a book, really read, get some foundational work. Because when I got into this Enneagram spirit, I didn't know a whole lot, and I love you as my brother, but I didn't want to just take what you say as the gospel either, right? I wanted to
That's
really
right. Yeah.
learn and read. And a very healthy sexualist, naturally, we're going to do that stuff. An unhealthy sexualist would do that too. But again, be very wary of getting caught up on one or two things, right? Look at the whole approach and the whole holistic value of it all.
Mhm. Man, that was good. Man, okay. Um, and just to wrap up, is there anywhere specific you would want people to go to visit or to donate to be a part of or to reach out to you? Is there anything like that you want the audience to know? Anything like that?
Sure. I mean, you could, for me, I don't really do too much social media. For me, you can always reach out to my personal email, Gibbs at yahoo.com. I do a pretty good job at responding to that. Another thing that you can always just reach out to is any type of mental health resource that you have, right? There's a ton of mental health resources out there. We have, the CDC website that leads to mental health resources. We have the American Psychiatric Association that leads to mental health resources. You can also just do a quick Google search as well. I work in a very private sector of the military sphere, but I also do outsource to the community. Here in 2024, there's a lot going on from a political warfare standpoint, from a social warfare standpoint, that hurts and can absolutely cause what we call moral injury and impact our mental health. So I think it's really important in that drive of mental health of understanding that mental health is not just simply an emotional component. It's also a physical component. It's also a nurture component, which you're putting in your body. That holistic view is very, very important. So, from a layman standpoint, if you go to Google and you search up any type of like mental health website, that's a good place to start. I think mental health it's definitely getting a much bigger drive starting after COVID until now. Um, sometimes Milton, I know you're down south. Here up north, we have a lot of colder gray weather. So there's a lot of different things we do, such as getting the light boxes, making sure you're getting your vitamin D, all those little different things. But I truly believe mental health is totally integrated in the Enneagram sphere because all of that
Mhm.
impacts itself, and sometimes the language is the same. But if you want more specifics, certainly reach out to my email, Gibbs at yahoo.com. Um, I love to give resources. I love to teach. I love to educate. I'm here to help. And that's part of my role is to be an ambassador, not just to my community, but to anybody else in that general mental health sphere.
Man, bro, thank you. Like that was man, that was awesome. I don't know if y'all know this man is brilliant. If you couldn't hear it, this man is freaking brilliant. And I'm thankful to have you as a brother for sure, man. This is it's just brilliant. I don't think people even understand like the level of growth and seriousness around your inner work and just like I would almost say almost the exponential growth because you've been serious in it. Like when you lock in, that the growth isn't incremental, it becomes exponential, which is crazy when I like the experiences that I've had and the ones that I see you're doing. I love it. So one, thank you for being on the show because this is going to be super helpful to listeners, man. And like, I feel like this episode is super important too because I feel like many people don't understand the sexy six very well. I don't think they
Mhm.
do. And they have reactions or feelings, but they don't really understand what's going on underneath the hood and they don't understand how big their hearts are. And so, like, I think this is important for them to really hear. So, it landing, like what you did, I'm just grateful. And I'm proud as a brother here, and you're like, oh, let's get it. Right. And I'm proud as a podcast host being like, this is going to be great content for listeners because it's needed. Like, this is so needed. Man, thank you.
Sure. No, I thank you, and I appreciate you for inviting me on this platform. I think you're doing a wonderful job of spreading the word of the Enneagram. I think more people need to know about the Enneagram. And I think you do a very good job of just verbalizing it to the layman. Part of my inner growth is, seeing you and assessing you, and you provided a great outlet for me. First inviting me to Greece, and then allowing me to get into this Enneagram about being in this podcast. So I appreciate you for all that you do. Keep doing all that good hard work and laying the foundation for others. I love you, brother.
Love you too. Appreciate that. All right, for listeners, everything D was saying as far as how you can reach him or mental health resources will be in the show notes. You can go there and click on it. Last but not least, if you're feeling triggered, something's going on, take a deep breath and do it for the gram, the Enneagram, of course, and let's make a better and healthier choice. We'll see you next episode. Peace.